I think I see this as I think the title suggests that this is a celebration, not of one book, but of an entire a career, and I think it's entirely appropriate. And one of the things is, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think Tim has done 15 novels, 5 books of non-fiction. Sorry, 15 novels, 5 books of non-fiction. Um, and how many plays, Tim? 6 plays.
Six plays.
And then a screenplay and
Yeah.
short films and 4 children's books as
Yeah.
well. Uh, Now, one of the things that you take away from this is just an extraordinary output. But I think more important than just volume is just the sheer staggering diversity of what you've done. And so I'll start with that first. A question relating to diversity. What has led you to sort of travel through so many, what's led you to become a genre bender?
Well, it happened virtually by accident, because in the publishing world, once you have written a book that is done very well, you are expected to repeat that same book or same genre time and time again. Now, what happened for me is that my first novel was set in the Midlands about Indian immigrants. And I followed this by a non-fiction book called The New Savages, which is a documentary book which is set up in Liverpool. Now, so those 2 books are within a genre about race, immigrants, and the conflict with them, between them and the white society in which they lived in. Now, normally a writer would then try and do another novel or another book which had the same theme of racism, immigrants, or a love story of some kind. Well, the marriage is a love story of one kind. But at that time, I got somewhat distracted by reading a very powerful book on climate change, which concerned me very much. And so I was trying to work on something else when this climate change book I'd read, I wanted to turn it into fiction. And because of what it said was really what happened in 2020 with the COVID. I had written about that in 1968 in my novel, The Oblivion Tapes. So having done that, I should have then followed up with another book, which should have been a kind of futuristic book. But unfortunately, I went again. So it's not something I meant to do, but then ideas took hold of me, and my publishers, Macmillan, then said, look, you have to stay to one genre. You can't keep moving around. So publishers demand that you do one thing only. The moment you start moving around, they get worried, because if a reader has read something that they really like, which is, say, a love story, the next book you do happens to be a crime story, it totally throws them. So it is something that happened to me, partly by accident, but a lot by choice, because at that time something had occurred around the world or inside me, and I wanted to write a different book from the one I'd done previously.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it is entirely by choice, because if you went, almost entirely by choice, if you went against the wishes of publishers. But my question is, are you sort of constantly challenging yourself in a way? Okay, thank you, I've done fiction, so I'll do non-fiction. I've done them both, so I'll do children's fiction. I'll do a play, I'll do a screenplay. Is it like you want to push every boundary? Is that a part of your...
It is part of it, because, again, coming back to genre, once you do one genre, you're sort of trapped in a world in which you're really just recycling the same kind of story. So once I decided I'd really want to explore other parts, there's a challenge out there, that I should try something else. And that is why I think after the book, The Oblivion Tapes, I then, unfortunately or fortunately, had a bad love affair. So I then wrote a romantic comedy. So that is what happened. It was a challenge. But at the same time, there's a chance of writing a script, which I wanted to do. So each time, it is me trying to explore a larger part of myself and a larger part of the world I live in, to try and reflect it in my books in one way or another. And as you say, that uh, when I look at what I'm trying to do, like if I decide that the only way I can tell a story is by doing a stage play, and I try and look at it and see, well, how else I can do it, and I find it'll really work well if I do it as a stage play rather than doing it as a novel, because it's not as long as a novel, which is 100,000 words, but I can encapsulate it in a very dramatic stage play. So those are the choices I kind of make when I decide I'm going to do something. And I had also the experience of writing the script for Daira.
Yeah.
Now, Daira came about. I was living in the States then, and I came back and was traveling with my wife and my sister in a part of Tamil Nadu somewhere. I can't remember where, near Nilgiris. And I asked the driver to stop the car because there was a beautiful girl looking after some goats, a village girl. And I thought I'd go out and take a photograph of her. So I went out and took a photograph, and she saw me, screamed, and ran away. And next moment I know, but 5 men come running out with sights in their hands. And luckily my sister and my wife were there, so they didn't hack me to death immediately. So they waited until I could tell them what I was doing. So that happened, and I thought of writing it as a novel. But then I started thinking of it, writing it as a screenplay, which is what Daira was. It's a story of this girl who is kidnapped and how she manages, with an LGBT person helping her, to try and reach a safer place. So these things happen, and
Yeah.
it's sort of, when I look at something, can I do it this way or can I do it that way? Which
Right.
would be, for me, the best.
Yeah, so I was just noticing there's, even within your nonfiction, there's a sort of incredible variety. For instance, you've done a story on Mumtaz Mahal, which is more history, and then you've done others, which is sort of personally related to your personal life. So there's variety there. But since you brought up the screenplay, Daria, I just want to, this is directed by Amol Palekar, right? And sort of got lots of very, very positive.
Very
critical-
good reviews, and
Yeah.
Time magazine chose it
Yeah.
as one of the
So
10 best.
were you sort of happy with the film overall? Were you sort of, did it do justice to your screenplay, or do you have?
I didn't think they did justice, and Amol Palekar and I fell out a lot because of what he was trying to do. And at the London Film Festival, we actually had a virtually on-stage fight about it. In one way, it is kind of, that was kind of my fault as well. See, in a film, the director is the king. But I was so determined to try and get this script done the way I wanted it. So in one way, I was a bit inexperienced because I was demanding that the director do exactly what I wanted. The director saw it as a totally different way. And the director will always look at something direct opposite to what the writer has done. And any writer who's had his books established will know that's never the kind of film he wanted to see on screen. So in that context, with Daira, I finally did get my own back in a way, because I then directed a stage play in Leicester, and I had Parminder Nagra play the main role. So at least there, I came back to what I was trying to do in that screenplay as a stage play. And I had this very good cast of Asian Indians playing the role, with Padmanabhan the main role. And it is very satisfying at doing it, even though it didn't. I was hoping it would go to Broadway, but it never did. But in that context, I sort of uh, I got my back to what I wanted to do on the screen. I could do it on the stage.
So, I mean, I can't think of too many writers in India who've done as much in terms of diversity. I mean, very few, at least, hardly anyone comes to mind immediately. But I want to ask a question. How do you think others, say the publishing world, say the critics, the audience, readers, have reacted to this? I mean, on the one hand, I can look at this output and say, wow, I mean, how many people have done this before? On the other hand, are there people who say, or who think that maybe you should have stuck to one, your real strength, and or if there is one real strength, maybe you have multiple real strengths. But is there, could there be any justification for someone saying, look, or feeling, that you've spread yourself very thin, maybe you should have just focused on doing one thing? Is there any merit in that? I mean, I don't feel that myself, but just as a question, could a publisher say, yeah, okay, will the real Tim Murari stand up?
Well, the publishers finally, you must understand now, when books were first published, they were published by small companies, Macmillan and Knopf. But today, publishing is an industry. And I emphasize the word industry, like the motor industry, the aeroplane industry. It's an industry. All these companies, the Penguins, the Random House, Simon Schuster, are probably owned by Bertelsmann in Germany, one of the biggest publishing houses. So they are the ones that demand that you write this kind of book. If you don't, you're not going to get very far. And the readers, which they try and promote the book for a type of reader who's read the first book, then wants to read the second book, and wants to read the third book. Also, my readers get confused as well. I'll give you a perfect example of confusion, because I had written...
Perfect example of?
Of confusion among my publishers.
All right. Yeah.
I'd written...
Yep.
I had written a novel, partly it's set on my family, which is set in Bangalore. It is called Field of Honor, and it was republished recently as Gunboat Jack. Now, this is a book that took place entirely in India, in Bangalore, where I went to school I was in school here as well, which my publisher then was Simon & Schuster. And they paid me a lot of money for it because they really liked it. And Michael Cordam was my editor there, who was the biggest editor in New York at that time. So Michael loved the book and everything else. Then he asked me, what's your next book? Unfortunately, having finished this book, I then spent 4 months making a film documentary on homicide detectives in the South Bronx. This was done for a British television company as part of a trilogy I was writing. So I ended up at 4 months, maybe 5 months, then constant in the company of homicide detectives, cops, in one of the worst parts of New York, in the South Bronx, the 47th Precinct. So at the end of that time, when I was trying to write my next Indian novel, I couldn't. I ended up writing a very dark novel about cops in New York. So I went back to Calder and said, look, I've just done this book. He took one look at it and says, no, I wanted you to write another Indian book. So in one way, you can say I'm self-defeating by writing something else, which sometimes these things overtake your mind.
Yeah.
I spent too much time with these cops all night long and drinking with them, so I knew their stories very well, and they were just in my mind, and I couldn't get them out of my mind.
Yeah.
Until
So one of your novels, which you wrote way back, I think, in 2004, The Arrangements of Love was going to be made into a film. And we saw little snippets appearing and little stories appearing in the newspapers. This was going to be directed by Philip John of Downton Abbey. And then I think Shruti Hassan was supposed to act in it and so on. And then for some completely extraordinary, almost bizarre reason, the film gets shelved. So can you just talk us through what happened in some detail?
Sometimes I don't want to think of it.
No. This you have to do.
What happened here is, as Mukund says rightly, it's all cast, good director. It's a British-Indian co-production, and the camera, the sound, assistant directors. There were about 20 came in from England to do the shoot, and the rest of the crew were from here. So on April 1st, ironically, it's all set up to shoot. And I went there, they did a puja before it. The actors were there in Shruti, and the Indian male lead was a guy called Vivek Karla. That name is burnt in my mind. So they start the rehearsals, and you've got a crew of about 100 people around. Lights, everything is ready, sets are ready. This Vivek Karla, who is an Asian Brit, said 10 minutes into rehearsal, he said, "It's too hot. I can't work in India." And he walked off the set.
Well, it's tragic, but tragicomic in a way.
It is tragic because the British crew were here, the Indian crew were all ready, and as I say, when you're seeing a film being shot, there are about 100 to 120 people around. Lights, camera, people making tea, all this, the assistant cameraman, and I say half the crew were British.
So can't they find a heat-resistant Indian Brit and
well, that's what they've been searching for since, I'm told.
Okay.
But the film companies took a heavy loss because they must have cost them
So just a quick question: how come they picked up a 2004 novel to make a film 15 years later? I mean, is there a story there? Not one of you.
This happens to many novels, just not mine. If you look at many films, you find that the novels are maybe published 15, 20, 30 years ago.
Okay.
And they're suddenly brought up. And so mine is no exception. That the producer of the film was from Hyderabad, and she had bought the novel when it came out and had lived with it and was determined to get it made. So this happens, and as I say, my book is not an exception. You'll often see a very good film, and it turns out the book was published in 1945 or something.
Yeah. So, okay, couple more questions. We live in Madras, and we live in a place that has some kind of art scene. I'm talking about contemporary art. And one of the common complaints in the contemporary art scene is that if you are in Madras in some way, you're at a disadvantage. And I'm wondering whether this is true of South Indian writers in English generally as well. Do you think it's a disadvantage, location is a disadvantage, if you are an Indian writer in English?
I think South Indian writers are ignored by the publishing industry because all the publishers are North Indian and they're set in Delhi. And so their view of the world is Delhi, Bombay, Calcutta. And anything south of the Vindhyas is something they look at which I think with a lot of doubt, and they don't push South Indian writers as much as they push the North Indian ones. This I found, partly not only me, but some other good South Indian writers, either from Bangalore or a very good writer in Calicut who I admire. His books are never promoted the way some novels written by a Delhi writer or a Calcutta writer are really pushed. So I feel there is this divide between North and South in publishing. And it's something that it's affected other parts of our lives as well. There's north-south conflict.
Ironically, I mean, this is not related to you necessarily, but it doesn't seem to play out when it comes to writing in Indian languages. I mean, you have, for instance, someone like Perumal Murugan, whom probably is, thanks to translations, one of the best-known names one of the best-known translated and awarded, routinely, in prizes for his fiction. It seems to be much more, this probably this sort of relative neglect happens when you write in English. It's just an observation. You
Well, I mean, R.K. Narayan wrote in English and was certainly acknowledged around the world.
at a different time before it became an industry.
Sorry?
Before it became,
Well, I have, I read Perumal Murugan and admire his novels very much, and they deserve to be translated. And luckily, they found a very good publisher. And he also wrote mainly his books in South India. And all his books
Yeah.
are set in villages,
okay.
which sets
So
a good,
Yeah.
That's why his popularity is growing, because he keeps to one genre and sets them
Yeah.
within one area.
So you're working on a memoir now, and that's your next. So that's another sort of
That's
new
another
addition
story
to
altogether.
another bit of gender bending. So
Yeah. Yeah, I never tried one before.
How's that going?
Well, I finished a draft about half of my life.
Okay.
If I'm still alive, I might try the second half of
Okay.
my life.
So last bit, would you like to read for like about a couple of minutes from your last novel, Chicanery, before we bind up, or should we just throw it open to questions?
I prefer.
You prefer questions? Okay. Prefer questions or?
I prefer questions.
Okay. Right. Question there.
I mean, so much of your writing has taken elements from your life, right? So, I mean, the autobiographical sort of element and motif has been quite strong, I think, in your writing across the books that you have written. I mean, was that deliberate? Was that something that you had planned on, or did elements from your life kind of provoke you to write, to center a book around those stories or those people or those narratives?
Sorry, I couldn't quite clear.
Can you repeat that?
Yeah,
Why didn't you come here without that mic?
no, I'm saying
Yeah,
so many of your books have autobiographical elements, right? I mean,
Yes.
there are. So, was that a deliberate decision that came from, certain things that provoked you in your life to write? Certain people or events or narratives or stories, was that a deliberate decision, or was it something that happened more spontaneously?
Well, it happened. I mean, it's very spontaneous. I became a writer by sheer chance because I had no intention of becoming a writer. I left England to study electronics, and electronics and I just didn't get on at all. So I was in McGill and in Montreal, and I had to work my way through summers in a logging camp, and I came back to McGill, to university, and then I found I just wanted to write something about my experience in that logging camp. And I wrote that and sent it off blindly to a paper I admired very much, the Manchester Guardian, and they published it. And once they published it, I wrote for them again, and then I wrote for that newspaper for 25 years. So it happened spontaneously. It wasn't something I planned, because as a young man, I didn't know what I wanted to do. My brother became a doctor. I was supposed to be an engineer. That was the family pattern at that time. So since I couldn't become an engineer, I became a writer.
Any other question? No?
I'd like to first of all thank Mukund very much for giving me his time and and tolerating me in these questions and answers. Thank you very much, Mukund.